Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Paranoid Stories. Before we start, make sure to leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. I'm really interested in that. Now let's begin. I keep telling myself there's a rational explanation, but I've been back from that trip for 8 months now, and I still check my hairbrush every morning. I'm a software developer, 43, divorced. Pretty standard life. For the past 7 years, I've taken a solo fishing trip to Lake Mildred up in the Cascade foothills. 3 days of quiet, decent trout fishing, no cell service. It's not remote enough to be dangerous, just isolated enough that I rarely see anyone else. The kind of place where you can actually hear yourself think. This was last October. I got to the trailhead around noon on a Friday, hiked the 2 miles in, and set up camp in my usual spot. A flat clearing about 30 yards from the western shore. The lake's maybe a quarter mile across, surrounded by old-growth Douglas fir and hemlock. Beautiful in that Pacific Northwest way where everything's slightly damp and moss-covered. I was setting up my tent when I noticed something odd through the trees. A flash of light, like sun catching glass. I figured maybe another camper, though I'd never seen anyone else at this lake before. Curious, I walked toward it. That's when I found the mirror. And it was leaning against the base of a massive Douglas fir, maybe 50 feet from my campsite. And I mean leaning carefully, deliberately, like someone had placed it there. The thing was huge, probably 5 feet tall, 3 feet wide, with an ornate wooden frame that looked antique. Heavy, the kind of mirror you'd see in a nice hotel lobby or an old mansion. Out here, in the woods, miles from any road. The frame wasn't weathered at all. No moss, no water damage, nothing. The glass was spotless, perfectly clean, reflecting the trees behind me with absolute clarity. I walked around the fir to see if there was a cabin or structure I'd somehow missed over the years, but there was nothing, just forest. I should have left it there, I know that, but I kept thinking about the frame. It had to be worth something, and it seemed wrong to just leave something that nice out in the woods to rot. So I carried it back to camp. Took me 2 trips because of the weight, had to drag it part of the way. I propped it against a tree near my tent, facing the woods, away from the lake. The reflection looked normal. Trees, undergrowth, fading afternoon light. That first night was uneventful. I fished until dusk, cooked some trout, read by headlamp for an hour, fell asleep around 10, slept fine. When I woke up Saturday morning, there was hair on my tent, not inside. On the outside of the rainfly near the entrance, a small clump of long black hair, maybe 6 or 7 strands twisted together. Wet, not damp from dew. Actually wet, like someone had just gotten out of a shower. I picked it up. It was real hair, human hair. The texture was slightly coarse and it was cold to the touch in a way that felt wrong for something organic. Look, I'm not an idiot. I know animals exist. Bears, deer, whatever. But this wasn't animal hair. And there's no explanation for why it would be wet when everything else was dry. It hadn't rained. The morning dew hadn't even formed yet. I threw it into the fire pit from the night before and tried to forget about it. Spent the day fishing. Caught 3 decent rainbow trout. Tried to enjoy myself. The mirror was still there when I got back to camp that evening, exactly where I'd left it. I considered moving it, maybe covering it with my tarp, but that felt stupid. It's just a mirror, so I left it alone. That night I had trouble sleeping, not because of anything I heard or saw. The woods were quiet, normal, but I kept thinking about that hair, where it came from. Why it was wet. Sunday morning. More hair. This time it was a bigger clump, maybe 20 or 30 strands, twisted and matted together in a loose tangle. Also wet, also cold. It was caught on one of my tent stakes this time, wrapped around it like someone had deliberately placed it there. The strands were longer too. Before they'd been maybe 6 inches. These were closer to a foot. My hands were shaking when I pulled it off the stake. I don't know why this detail matters, but it stuck with me. When I held it up to the light, I could see it was all from the same head. Not random loose hairs, but a coherent clump, like someone had cut it off in one piece. I threw it in the fire pit with the rest of my trash and walked down to the lake to clear my head. The water was still, that mirror-perfect calm you get on windless mornings. I could see the far shore clearly, maybe 400 yards across, empty, just trees and rocks and that thin strip of muddy beach. When I got back to camp, I looked at the mirror, really looked at it. It was still reflecting the woods behind it, exactly as it should. But something felt off about the angle, like it had shifted slightly, though I knew I hadn't touched it. The reflection showed the same trees, the same undergrowth, but the perspective seemed different somehow. I packed up most of my gear that afternoon, told myself I was just cutting the trip short by a few hours. No big deal. I'd stay one more night, leave first thing Monday morning. I shouldn't have stayed. Monday morning, I woke up before dawn. Still dark outside, and the smell hit me immediately. That wet hair smell, like a locker room or a damp bathroom, strong enough to make me nauseous. I turned on my headlamp and unzipped the tent. Hair, everywhere, draped across the rainfly, wound around the guy lines, piled in clumps near the entrance. Long strands, at least 2 or 3 feet each, all black, all soaking wet. Enough to fill both hands. I stumbled backward out of the tent and my headlamp caught the mirror. It had turned. I know how that sounds. Mirrors don't turn themselves. But I'm telling you, it had rotated. Not a lot, maybe 20 degrees. So it was now reflecting the lake instead of the woods. I could see myself in it, standing there in my boxers and a t-shirt, headlamp beam cutting through the dark. Behind my reflection, I could see the lake, visible through the trees. And on the far shore, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, something was standing in the water. I turned around, looked at the actual lake, not the reflection. Nothing. The shore was empty. I looked back at the mirror. It was still there in the reflection, tall, impossibly tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, standing motionless in the shallows on the far side, and it was covered in hair. Not wearing it, covered, like the hair was growing from everywhere, hanging in long wet sheets that dragged in the water around its legs. I couldn't see a face, just hair, black and dripping. I stood there for maybe 5 seconds, looking back and forth between the real lake and the reflection. The thing was only visible in the mirror. Then in the reflection, it took a step forward, into deeper water. The hair spread around it like ink. I ran, left everything. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, all of it. Grabbed my car keys from my pants pocket and ran. 2 miles back to the trailhead in 23 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when I got to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I called the ranger station later that day, told them I'd had to evacuate my campsite due to a possible bear encounter and left my gear. They said they'd send someone to check on it. A week later they called back, said they'd found my tent and most of my equipment. No mention of a mirror. I didn't ask. The thing is, it's not over. Every few weeks, I find a single long black hair in my apartment, on my pillow, in my shower drain. Once, wrapped around my car's door handle, always wet. I'm not someone who goes looking for weird stuff. I'm a pretty practical person, for context. Business major at University of Oregon, work nights to pay rent, study during the day. The overnight attendant gig at Cascade Indoor Tennis seemed perfect when I started 6 months ago. 12-hour shifts from 11 p.m. to 11 a.m., Wednesday through Saturday. The place is huge, 16 courts spread across this warehouse-sized building off River Road. After 10 p.m., it's basically dead. My whole job is sitting at the front desk, doing homework, making sure the building doesn't burn down, and locking up in the morning. The first time I heard it was maybe 3 weeks into working there. Around 2:30 in the morning, I was reading from my marketing class when I heard this sound from somewhere in the back courts. That distinct pop and bounce of a tennis ball being served hard. You know that sound if you've spent any time around tennis. The hollow thwack of the racket, then the sharp bounce on the court surface. Crystal clear, unmistakable. I figured someone had stayed late, even though I'd done my walkthrough at midnight and the whole place was empty. So I walked back to check. The courts run in 2 rows of 8, separated by this long hallway with viewing windows. Court 6 is on the right side, about halfway down. The lights were motion activated to save energy, and the court was dark, which meant nobody had moved in there for at least 15 minutes. I flipped on the lights anyway. Nothing. Net perfectly still, no equipment lying around, no tennis balls anywhere on the court, just the green surface and the white lines and the absolute silence of an empty room. Went back to the desk, tried to focus on my reading. 20 minutes later, I heard it again. Same court, same sound. That perfect serve, the ball hitting the exact center of the court. This time, I basically ran back there. Lights still off, which meant they'd timed out. Turned them on again. Nothing. Same empty court, same untouched net. Look, I'm not an idiot. I checked everything. The ventilation system, whether something outside could cause echoes, whether the building settled in weird ways. I even asked my manager Carl if Court 6 had any issues. He just shrugged and said it was the oldest court, original to the building when it opened in 1987, but nothing structural, no problems. It kept happening. Not every night, but maybe 3 or 4 times a week. Always Court 6, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Always that same sound. Serve, bounce, then nothing. No footsteps, no second ball, no sounds of someone moving around. Just that single serve and silence. After a month of this, I started documenting when it happened. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just leave, find another job? Honestly, the pay was too good and I needed it. Student loans aren't a joke. And during the day, in my apartment with my roommates around, it seemed almost manageable. Just weird building acoustics, right? Some quirk of the architecture. But the timing bothered me. It was too consistent, and it was always the same spot on the court. I could tell from the sound, the way it echoed. Dead center, right on the service line. I bought a motion-activated trail camera in early March, $50 at a sporting goods store, the kind hunters use. I mounted it on the observation window frame looking into Court 6, angled it to cover the whole court. Set it to take a photo and short video clip whenever it detected movement. The flash was bright as hell, but whatever, I needed to know. First 2 nights, nothing triggered it. Third night, I'm at the desk around 3 a.m. when I hear it again. That serve, that bounce. The sound so clear and close it could have been 10 feet away from me instead of 100 feet down the hall. I waited maybe 30 seconds, my heart doing something weird in my chest. Then I walked back there trying to keep my breathing steady. The lights were still off on Court 6. The camera's little red recording light was blinking. Something had triggered it. I didn't check it right then. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready. I finished my shift, locked up at 11, drove home. The camera's memory card sat in my backpack all day while I slept, and I kept waking up thinking about it, then forcing myself back to sleep. Finally looked at it around 6 p.m. before my next shift. My roommate Derek was making dinner in the kitchen, and I sat at our crappy IKEA table with my laptop. The timestamp showed 3:47 a.m. The video started with the empty court, lights off, everything still. Then, in the darkness at center court, a tennis ball just appeared. Not thrown, not dropped from above. Just suddenly there, materializing maybe 2 feet off the ground. It hit the court's surface exactly where I'd been hearing it, bounced twice, then rolled toward the net and stopped. The camera flash went off during the first bounce. In that split second of illumination, there was someone standing at the service line, right where the ball had appeared. The figure was impossibly thin, skeletal, with skin pulled tight over bones. Its face was tilted down, watching where the ball had landed, and it was smiling. Not a horror movie grimace. An actual smile, pleasant and satisfied, like someone who'd just hit a perfect serve. It held a wooden tennis racket in one hand, the old kind, with the small oval head and the leather grip. The flash lasted maybe a fraction of a second. When the video continued in darkness, the figure was gone, just the ball rolling to a stop near the net. I watched it maybe 20 times in a row sitting at that table. Derek asked if I was okay because apparently I'd gone completely pale. I couldn't answer him. My hands were shaking too badly to work the laptop trackpad. Here's the thing. I still went to work that night. I needed the money, and I couldn't explain to Carl why I was quitting without showing him the footage, and some part of me knew that showing anyone would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. I moved the camera to a different angle, more direct, higher resolution. I also set up my phone to record audio at the desk. If I was documenting this, I was doing it right. The sound came again at 2:14 a.m. I have the timestamp. I didn't go check the court. I just sat at the desk, listening to my own breathing, waiting for my shift to end. The camera caught it again. Same ball appearing from nowhere. Same impossible figure in the flash, still smiling, still holding that wooden racket. This time I could see more details in the frozen image. The figure's teeth were perfect and white, its eyes were dark hollows, and its tennis whites were old-fashioned, the kind with long sleeves and a collared shirt. I quit 2 days later. Told Carl it was because of my class schedule, which he didn't question. He seemed relieved, actually. Finding overnight people is hard. That was 4 months ago. I work at a 24-hour gym now, better hours, slightly worse pay. I still have the footage. I've never posted it anywhere or shown anyone except Derek, who suggested maybe I'd been having carbon monoxide hallucinations, except the camera saw it too. Sometimes I drive past Cascade Indoor Tennis on my way to campus. The building looks normal. People go in and out during the day, playing their matches, taking their lessons. Court 6 is in use like all the others. But I looked up the building's history last month. In 1989, 2 years after it opened, a tennis instructor named Michael Brenneman collapsed on Court 6 during a private lesson and died before the ambulance arrived. Heart defect, undiagnosed. He was 28. In the one photo I found from a local news archive, he's holding a wooden racket and smiling at the camera. The photo was taken on Court 6, right at the service line. I keep telling myself there has to be a rational explanation, but I've run through every single one and none of them work. I'm a freelance photographer, mostly commercial work, real estate, the occasional wedding. I'm not the type who goes looking for ghosts or whatever. Back in January, I got hired by a historical preservation society to document the old Tillamook Head lighthouse before they started renovation work. The structure had been decommissioned since the 70s, just sitting empty on this rocky outcrop about 40 miles south of Astoria. They wanted atmospheric shots, particularly at sunrise during storm season. The brief specifically asked for that dramatic coastal weather everyone associates with the Pacific Northwest. So when the forecast showed a serious winter storm rolling in, I saw my opportunity. The plan was simple. Drive out late afternoon, set up my equipment before dark, spend the night and catch the sunrise just as the storm broke. The lighthouse keeper's quarters were stripped bare, but the main structure was sound. I brought a sleeping bag, some food, my camera gear, and a diesel generator to keep my equipment charged and run a space heater. The Preservation Society gave me keys and a liability waiver, standard stuff. I arrived around 4, maybe 4:30, already getting dark. The wind was picking up, and I could taste salt spray even though the water was a good 100 feet below. The lighthouse itself was smaller than I expected, maybe 60 feet tall, white paint peeling in long strips, windows on the keeper's level boarded over from the inside. The lamp room at the top was accessible by a narrow spiral staircase, and there was a heavy steel door at the top with a padlock on it. I asked about access, and the project coordinator told me the lamp room was off limits. Structural concerns, insurance reasons, the usual. Fine by me. I only needed the keeper's level and the exterior shots anyway. I got the generator running, set up my base in what used to be the main living space, and did a test shoot from the gallery walk outside to check my exposures. The light was perfect, all gray and violent and moody. By 6, it was fully dark and the storm was really howling. Wind screaming around the tower, rain hitting the windows like gravel. I made some instant coffee on a camp stove, ate a protein bar, and settled in to wait for dawn. The noise started around 11. A single heavy impact from directly above me. I looked up at the ceiling. The lamp room was up there through that locked door at the top of the spiral stairs. 30 seconds of silence. Then the sound came again. Same sound, same location. Not a creak or a groan, the kind of sounds you'd expect from an old building in a storm. This was a heavy, deliberate impact, like something solid striking metal. It came again. Rhythmic. Maybe 45 seconds between each one. I tried to rationalize it. Loose equipment, maybe. Except the lamp room had been stripped when they decommissioned the light. I'd seen the inventory. There was nothing up there except the original Fresnel lens, which was bolted to a permanent mounting. I turned off the generator to hear better. The sudden silence was worse, just the wind and rain, and then, cutting through it, that heavy metallic impact. Louder without the generator noise. Definitely metal on metal. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the base of the spiral staircase. The steps were narrow, rusted in places. I climbed slowly, counting. 18 steps to a small landing, then the steel door. The padlock was still in place, untouched. I pressed my ear to the cold metal. Silence. I waited, counted to 60 in my head. Nothing. Right. Storm, old building, thermal expansion or wind pressure or something. I went back down, restarted the generator, and tried to focus on reviewing the photos I'd already taken. But the sound was in my head now. That perfectly regular interval, that weight behind it. It started again at 1:15. The heavy impact, then a pause, then again, then another pause. Heavier this time, more insistent. I found myself counting the intervals. 42 seconds, exactly. I timed it on my phone. Over and over. 42 seconds. Nothing natural keeps that kind of precision. Look, I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just leave? The storm was bad enough that I wasn't sure I could safely navigate the access road in the dark. It's barely a road, really, more like a track carved into the cliffside. One wrong turn, and I'd go straight into the ocean. And honestly, I kept thinking it had to be something simple, something I could identify and document, maybe even add to the chute, a little mystery for the Historical Society to solve. By 3 a.m, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my biggest flashlight and the bolt cutters I had brought for clearing brush around exterior shots, went back up those 18 steps. The padlock was old, but it took me 3 tries to cut through. My hands were shaking. The cold, I told myself. Just the cold. The door opened inward with a long, rusty shriek. I swept the flashlight across the lamp room. Empty. Completely empty. The Fresnel lens stood in the center on its mounting, a beautiful piece of Victorian engineering, all brass and prismatic glass. The walls were bare metal, painted white decades ago, now flaking and water-stained. No loose objects, no debris, nothing that could have made that sound. The impacts had stopped the moment I cut the padlock. I stood there in perfect silence, just the storm outside, and I felt my breathing start to even out. Stupid. It was all stupid. Probably just pressure changes in the walls or something. That's when I saw the lens. The glass panels were spotless. I mean perfectly, impossibly clean. Everything else in that room was covered in dust and grime and salt residue. But the lens looked like it had been polished that morning, and there were marks on it. 3 parallel grooves, each maybe 18 inches long, scored deep into the glass. They ran from upper left to lower right across the main central panel, not cracks, gouges, deliberate. The glass between them was powdered, crushed into the grooves like something had dragged across it with enormous pressure. I've worked with glass. I know what it takes to damage glass that thick. You need diamond-tipped tools. Serious force. And these marks were fresh. The exposed interior of each gouge was clean, unweathered. I reached out, not quite touching them, and my hand stopped shaking. Everything stopped. I stood there looking at those 3 perfect parallel lines, and my mind just went quiet. Not calm, empty. Something had been in this room. Something had dragged something across that lens with enough force to carve through glass. And I had heard it, over and over, that heavy impact again and again. I backed out of the lamp room, left the door open, went down the stairs, packed my gear with hands that didn't feel like mine, and waited in my car for enough light to risk the road. I didn't take any sunrise photos. The Preservation Society called me a week later to ask about the broken padlock. I told them I'd heard concerning noises and wanted to check for structural damage. I didn't mention the marks. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew how it would sound. They paid me for the shots I'd already taken and hired someone else for the sunrise work. I still have the photos on my hard drive. Sometimes I go through them, looking for something I missed. Any sign of what was up there with me. There's nothing. Just an empty lighthouse in a storm. But I measured those grooves before I left. Took reference shots with a ruler in frame, though I've never shown them to anyone. The spacing is precise, 4 inches between each mark, center to center, exactly 4 inches, like fingers. I'm telling this because I can't afford to keep seeing my therapist, and she said talking about it even to strangers might help me sleep again. I'm a seasonal ranger for the Forest Service, nothing glamorous. Mostly I check trail conditions, pick up trash, make sure the dispersed camping sites aren't getting trashed. I've been doing this for 6 years, and I've seen plenty of weird stuff. People doing drugs in the backcountry, illegal hunting camps, even a guy who'd been living in a tarp shelter for 3 months. But I'm a rational person. I deal with people problems, not whatever the hell this was. It was early October when I got assigned to check the northern loop of dispersed sites in the Willamette. These aren't official campgrounds, just clearings deep in the forest where people can pitch a tent if they're willing to hike in. Most don't see use after Labor Day. The trail was quiet, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the tent. I came around a bend maybe 4 miles in, and there it was in clearing 7. A dome tent, hunter green, probably a decent brand. Set up perfectly, guy lines taut, rainfly secured. The thing that made me stop was the lantern. It was lit, sitting just outside the tent flap, burning bright in the middle of the afternoon. Look, I've been doing this job long enough to know when something feels off. But protocol is protocol. I called out, did my usual Forest Service, just checking in routine. No response. I waited a solid 2 minutes, called again, nothing but wind in the Douglas firs, in woods. I approached slowly, announced myself again. The tent flap was partially unzipped. I could see inside without touching anything. Sleeping bag neatly rolled, a small backpack, and sitting dead center, placed carefully on a flat stone, was this doll. I don't know how else to describe it except it looked handmade, carved from fresh wood, maybe 8 inches tall. The detail work was incredible. It had articulated joints, tiny fingers, a face that was almost featureless except for 2 deep-set holes for eyes. The wood was pale, recently cut. I could smell the sap. The doll was positioned facing the tent opening, facing the trail. I backed away and checked the area. No other gear, no food hang, no sign of a campfire. Just the tent, the lantern, and that doll. I left a note on the tent. Standard stuff about permit requirements and checking back in 24 hours. I marked it in my log and continued my patrol. The next day I came back around noon. The tent was exactly the same. My note was gone. The lantern was still burning, or burning again, I couldn't tell which. But the doll wasn't in the tent anymore. It was on a stump about 20 feet up the trail, positioned in a break in the trees. Same pose, facing the trail, facing the direction I'd be coming from. My hands felt cold when I saw it. I'm not the type to spook easy, but something about seeing it moved, set up like that, it felt deliberate, like someone was watching me approach and wanted me to know it. I checked the tent again. Nothing else had changed. The sleeping bag, the backpack, all exactly where they'd been. I picked up the doll from the stump. The wood was still fresh, sticky with sap. The joints moved smoothly, like it had been carved by someone who really knew what they were doing. I put it back in the tent, zipped the flap completely shut, and hiked out. Here's the thing. I know what you're thinking. Obviously someone was messing with me. A hiker with too much time, right? That's what I told myself. But I'd checked the area both days. No footprints except mine and some deer tracks. The forest floor was soft from recent rain. You couldn't walk through there without leaving a trace. Third day, I brought my supervisor. I'd radioed in about the abandoned tent, said I wanted a witness before we cleared it out. We hiked in together, talking about normal stuff. His kid's soccer game, some staffing issues. The kind of conversation that makes you feel grounded. The tent was still there, lantern still burning. The doll was balanced on a branch directly above the tent, maybe 7 feet up. Same position, facing the trail. My supervisor saw it and went quiet. He's this practical guy, ex-military, not easily rattled. But he just stared at it for a long moment before saying, "That's creative." We took photos, documented everything. He suggested we pack up the tent and store it, file it as abandoned property. I climbed up and grabbed the doll from the branch. Up close, I noticed something I'd missed before. The wood grain looked like it had been selected deliberately. The patterns formed something almost like veins under skin. We cleared the tent together. My supervisor inventoried while I bagged everything. The backpack was empty except for wood shavings. The sleeping bag had never been used, still had the tags inside. When we got to the stone where the doll had originally been sitting, we found more shavings underneath, fresh ones. I was rolling up the tent when my supervisor said my name in this flat, careful tone. He was holding the doll, the original one I'd placed back in the tent that second day. Next to it, he'd found another doll, same size, same pale wood, same articulated joints, same featureless face with those deep-set eye holes. The second one was still damp. Wood shavings stuck to its surface. It had been carved recently, maybe that morning, maybe while we were hiking in. We both turned and looked at the forest around us at the same time. Dense trees, thick undergrowth, 1,000 places someone could stand and watch without being seen. But it was the silence that got to me. I realized I hadn't heard a single bird since we'd arrived. No squirrels, no insects, just wind. My supervisor made the call to pack everything out immediately. We worked fast, didn't talk much. I kept the second doll in my hand the whole hike back, and I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid if I put it down, I'd turn around and find 3. We filed the report. Abandoned campsite, no permit, possible squatter activity. The tent and gear went into property storage. The 2 dolls went into evidence bags, though evidence of what, nobody could say. I requested reassignment the next week, got transferred to the South District, closer to the ranger station, more day traffic areas. I told myself it was for practical reasons, better hours, but I haven't been back to that northern loop. The thing I can't stop thinking about isn't even the dolls themselves. It's the lantern. We documented that it was burning all 3 days, right? When they inventoried the tent at the station, they found the fuel reservoir was full, completely full, like it had never been lit at all. My wife keeps asking why I won't drive nights anymore, and I keep making up excuses about my back, about wanting to see daylight, about getting older. I can't tell her the real reason. I've been a long-haul trucker for 22 years, done routes through every state west of the Mississippi, logged probably 2 million miles, most of them alone in the dark. I'm not the type who spooks easy. You can't be. Not in this job. Those long, empty highways at 3 in the morning, you see things. Deer with eyes that catch your headlights wrong. Shadows from your own cargo shifting. Your brain plays tricks when you're tired. I've always known that. This was different. It happened on Highway 20, cutting through the high desert in eastern Oregon. February, about 4 months ago now. I was hauling furniture from Bend to Boise, running behind schedule because of a delay at the warehouse. Left around 11 at night, which meant I'd be driving through the dead hours, but I'd done it 1,000 times before. The route's mostly straight, mostly empty. High desert country, sagebrush and rock, and not much else for miles at a stretch. Around 1:30 in the morning, I was maybe 40 miles past Burns. No moon that night. Just my headlights cutting through the dark and the occasional reflector post along the shoulder. Radio was playing something, classic rock, I think, and I was in that zone you get into on long hauls where you're awake but your mind's sort of drifting. That's when I saw it in my peripheral vision. Driver's side maybe 10 feet out from the truck. A dark shape, upright, moving. My first thought was a person, which made no sense. We were in the middle of nowhere. No buildings, no crossroads, nothing. But it was person-shaped, and it was moving at the same speed as my truck. I was doing about 70. I turned my head to look directly at it, and there was nothing there. Just empty desert and darkness. I checked my side mirror. Nothing. Looked back at the road ahead, and the shape was there again in my peripheral vision, keeping perfect pace. I slowed down to 60. The shape slowed down, sped back up to 75. It matched me exactly, never gaining, never falling behind. Always just at the edge of my vision, where if I tried to look right at it, it disappeared. Look, I know how this sounds. Eye fatigue, highway hypnosis, whatever. I've experienced all that before. This wasn't that. This was solid. A dark figure, tall, moving with this weird loping stride that covered way too much ground. Not running exactly. More like gliding, but with the motion of running. I kept my eyes forward, watching it in my peripheral vision, trying to make out details without looking directly at it. The shape was wrong. The proportions. Arms too long, maybe, or legs that bent strange. It's hard to explain because I never got a clear view, but something about the way it moved made my stomach turn over. My hands started sweating on the wheel. I turned the radio off because I needed to focus, needed to figure out what I was seeing. The cabin got real quiet except for the diesel engine and the road noise. That's when I realized I could hear something else. A rhythmic sound, faint but distinct, coming from the driver's side. Like footfalls. Fast, repetitive impacts against the ground. Barely audible over the truck's noise, but definitely there. I was doing 75 miles per hour. Nothing runs that fast. Nothing. I checked the mirror again. Nothing. Looked ahead. There it was. Still keeping pace. This dark silhouette against the slightly less dark desert. I couldn't see features, couldn't see a face, but I had this overwhelming sense that it was aware of me, that it knew I could see it. The rest area was coming up in about 5 miles. I could see the sign in my headlights. Part of me wanted to floor it, get away from whatever this was, but another part, the part that's kept me alive through ice storms and blown tires and every other road hazard, told me not to make any sudden moves, just keep steady, get to the rest area, get around people. Except there wouldn't be people, not at 2 in the morning in the middle of the high desert. I knew that even as I thought it. Those 5 miles took forever. The shape never wavered, never changed position. Always there in my peripheral vision, always gone when I looked directly at it. The footfall sounds continued, impossibly fast, impossibly steady. I pulled into the rest area doing about 40, slowing down gradual. The shape slowed with me. I pulled into a parking spot near the bathroom building. There were no other vehicles, and put the truck in park. The engine idled. I kept my hands on the wheel. The shape was still there, standing now, not moving, just outside my window, maybe 8 feet away, perfectly still. I sat there for probably 2 minutes, not moving, barely breathing. My shirt was soaked through with sweat. Finally, I looked directly at the driver's side window. Nothing. Empty parking lot. Bathroom building with a single light over the door, darkness beyond. I don't know why I got out of the cab. Maybe I needed to prove to myself there was nothing there. Maybe I was still thinking rationally, trying to find a logical explanation. I opened the door and stepped down, and the desert cold hit me like a slap. It had been warm in the cab, no tracks in the dirt beside the truck. I checked. The ground was hard-packed and rocky, but there should have been something if a person or animal had been running alongside me for that long. Nothing. Then I walked around to the driver's side and saw the paint, a strip about 6 inches wide running the entire length of the truck from just below the window to the rear axle. The paint was scraped completely off, down to bare metal. Not scratched, scraped, like something had been dragging against it with continuous pressure. The metal was actually warm when I touched it, warm from friction. I stood there looking at that scraped strip, and my legs went weak. I had to sit down on the pavement. Here's the thing. Nothing I'd seen in my peripheral vision had appeared to be touching the truck. The shape had been several feet away, but something had been there. Something had been running alongside my truck at 75 miles per hour, pressed against the driver's side hard enough to scrape paint off in a perfectly straight line for 30 feet. I got back in the cab and drove straight to Boise. Didn't stop again. Kept my eyes forward, didn't look at the mirrors, didn't look at my peripheral vision. The sun came up around 6, and I've never been so grateful for daylight in my life. I told my dispatcher the paint damage happened at the warehouse. Insurance covered the repaint. I haven't driven Highway 20 at night since. Won't ever again. I'm a building inspector. Have been for almost 8 years now, mostly commercial properties, but I do residential stuff too when the work's slow. I've seen foundation cracks that could swallow a car, black mold that looked like something alive, hoarder houses where you couldn't see the floor. Point is, not much surprises me anymore. Or it didn't. The call came in early October. Young couple bought a Victorian in Irvington, one of those painted ladies that looks pretty from the street but needed a thorough inspection before they moved in. The realtor had done a basic walkthrough, but the buyers wanted everything documented properly. Standard stuff. I showed up on a Thursday morning with my usual kit: moisture meter, thermal camera, flashlight, notepad, drill for sample holes if needed. The house was actually in decent shape. Good bones, as we say. Newer electrical, updated plumbing, roof looked solid. I was working my way up floor by floor, checking for the usual culprits. Got to the 3rd floor, and that's when I noticed something off about the dimensions. The stairwell landing felt wrong. I've done this long enough that I can usually eyeball a space and know if the measurements add up. I went back down to the 2nd floor, counted my steps across the hallway, then went back up and did the same on the 3rd. There was about 8 feet missing, just gone, unaccounted for. I checked the blueprints the buyers had given me. Original plans from 1904, plus a renovation permit from the 80s. Nothing showed a gap. I knocked along the wall at the top of the stairs, listening for the change in sound that indicates a void. Found it about 3 feet in. Someone had drywalled over something and textured it to match. Done a decent job too. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking. My first thought was someone had closed off a storage space, maybe because of water damage or structural issues. Happens all the time in these old places. I should have just noted it in my report and recommended the buyers have it opened up professionally. That's what I should have done. But I had my drill with me, and the couple was paying for a thorough inspection. I figured I'd take a quick look, maybe snap a photo with my borescope camera. Just do my job properly. I put on my dust mask and safety glasses, selected a 1/2-inch bit, and drilled into the drywall about chest height. Went through the drywall easy enough. Only one layer, which was weird for a wall that should be load-bearing. Hit the backing, probably original lathe and plaster, pushed through that too. The bit broke through into empty space. I pulled it out and leaned in close to the hole, listening first before I looked. That's standard procedure when you're opening up a closed space. You want to know if there's water movement, or critters, or gas. Could be anything behind there. I heard something. Real soft at first. A dry, papery sound. like something shifting. Then it got closer to the hole, and I could hear it better. Scratching. Not frantic or aggressive, just persistent. Regular. Something inside that space moving toward the light from the hole. I stepped back, told myself it was probably a rat, maybe a squirrel that had gotten trapped in there during the renovation. Wouldn't be the first time I'd found something like that. But the sound didn't stop. It kept going, steady and deliberate. I got my borescope camera out. It's basically a thin, flexible cable with a light and lens on the end, connects to my phone so I can see into spaces I can't reach. I've used it hundreds of times to check inside walls, under foundations, in crawl spaces, completely routine tool. I fed the cable through the hole. The light clicked on automatically and I watched my phone screen as the camera pushed into the darkness. I was expecting to see studs, insulation, maybe some old newspapers they used to use as backing. Instead, the light just kept reaching into empty space. No back wall, no floor directly below. Just dark. I pushed more cable in, got about 3 feet of it through the hole before the camera angle tilted down enough for me to see what was below. The space wasn't 8 feet deep. The light from the camera couldn't find the bottom. Just kept going down into black like I'd drilled into some kind of shaft. But that was impossible. I was on the 3rd floor. Below this should have been the 2nd floor ceiling, the 1st floor, then the basement. But the camera was showing me depth that shouldn't exist. And then the light caught something at the edge of its range. The floor, when it finally appeared in the frame, wasn't wood or concrete. It was dirt, packed earth, dark and dry, and covering it, pressed into it like some kind of offering, were bones. Small ones. Finger bones, I think. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all arranged with their tips pointing upward. They were old, dried out, yellowed like ancient ivory. The light from my camera made them cast tiny shadows across the dirt. The scratching sound hadn't stopped. I could hear it clearly now, coming from somewhere in that impossible space. Not from where the bones were, but from somewhere beyond the camera's light range. My hands started shaking. I tried to pull the camera back, but I fumbled it, and the cable slipped a few more inches into the hole. The phone screen showed the camera dropping, spinning, and for just a second before I yanked it back out, the light swept across something else down there. A wall. Or what looked like a wall, so far back it was barely visible. And on it, in neat rows, were more bones. Not fingers this time, larger ones, arranged in careful patterns like wallpaper. I got the camera out of there, coiled the cable with hands that wouldn't stay steady. The scratching was louder now, closer, like whatever was in there knew I'd seen it and was trying to reach the hole. I grabbed my drill and some wood filler from my kit, plugged that hole so fast I didn't even smooth it properly. The scratching stopped the second I sealed it, just cut off mid-sound. Complete silence. I finished the inspection. Don't ask me how. I walked through the rest of the house like I was on autopilot. Checked the attic, the basement, wrote up my notes. I didn't mention the space. I wrote that the 3rd floor had some minor dimensional irregularities that should be checked by a structural engineer, kept it vague and professional. I've never done that before. I've never filed an incomplete report. The couple called me 2 weeks later to thank me. Said they'd moved in and everything was perfect. I almost warned them. Almost told them to tear open that wall and see what was really there. But what would I have said? That I found a space that couldn't exist filled with bones and darkness? They would have thought I was insane. Here's what keeps me up at night. I went back and looked at the original blueprints again, really studied them. That space isn't on any of the plans, not from 1904, not from the 80s. But there's a notation on the 1904 drawing, in the margin near where that wall should be. It's in German, faded and hard to read. I had to get it translated. It says, "Do not open, sealed by order of the physician. May God have mercy." I still have the footage on my phone. I've watched it maybe 50 times, trying to convince myself I saw something else. But every time, there they are. All those small bones pressed into impossible earth, pointing up like they're trying to reach something. The scratching starts sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. I know it's just in my head, some kind of trauma response. But it sounds exactly the same as it did that day. Soft and persistent and patient. The couple still lives there, far as I know. I drive past sometimes late at night when I can't sleep. All the lights are off except one on the 3rd floor, right about where that wall would be. I keep telling myself there's got to be a rational explanation, but 5 years later I still check every coin that comes through my register. I'm pretty level-headed about weird stuff for context. I work overnights at a gas and go off exit 253 just south of Salem. It's one of those old independent places that somehow hasn't been bought out yet. Fluorescent lights that hum too loud, linoleum from the 80s, and a coffee machine that's probably a health code violation. The overnight shift pays an extra $2 an hour, and I was saving for a better car, so I didn't mind the quiet. Most nights I'd see maybe 10 customers between 11 and 6 in the morning, truckers mostly, sometimes someone who'd miscalculated their fuel. Nobody interesting. It was a Tuesday in March, raining like it does out here, not dramatic, just constant and gray. The kind of night where you don't expect anyone at all. I was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when I heard the door chime. The guy who walked in was soaked. Not damp, not caught in the rain, wet. Soaked through like he'd been submerged. Water ran off his clothes in actual streams, pooling on the floor with each step. He wore dark pants and a white button-down shirt that clung to him, both looking oddly old-fashioned. Not costumey, just cut in a way you don't see anymore. His hair was plastered to his head, and his face was pale, really pale, with this grayish tint that made me think hypothermia. "Hey man, you okay?" I called out. "You need me to call someone?" He didn't answer, didn't even look at me, just walked straight down the center aisle toward the back of the store, leaving this dark, wet trail across the floor. His shoes made this squelching sound with each step. I came around the counter already thinking I'd need to mop up. We kept towels in the back office. I was going to offer him one, but he'd already turned around, moving down the snack aisle with this weird, deliberate pace, not slow exactly, but careful, measured. He stopped in front of the crackers, reached out, and took a single package of saltines, the cheap kind in the red and white wrapper. Then he walked straight to my register and set them down. Up close, he looked worse. His lips had a blue tinge and his skin had this texture to it, kind of waxy, kind of slack. His eyes were open, but they didn't seem to focus right, like he was looking through me at something else. The smell hit me then. Salt and rot and something mineral I couldn't place. It was strong enough to make my throat close up a little. Just these? I scanned the crackers. $1.79. He reached into his pocket. His movements were stiff, and water dripped from his sleeves onto the counter. What he pulled out made me freeze. Coins, but not normal ones. Heavy silver coins, larger than quarters, with this dull gleam that looked wrong under the fluorescent lights. He counted them out one by one, setting them on the counter with small metallic clicks. His fingers were wrinkled, not like from a long bath, but deeply, permanently wrinkled, pruned. I picked one up. It was cold, colder than it should have been, even if he'd just come in from outside. The date stamped on it read 1887. Another said 1892. All of them were from the 1800s, designs I'd never seen before. They were corroded around the edges, green and black in the crevices. "I can't take these," I said. "I mean, these might be worth something. You should..." He just stared at me with those unfocused eyes. Didn't blink, didn't move. Water dripped from his hair onto his shoulder. Here's the thing. I don't know why I did what I did next. Maybe it was how still he was. Maybe it was that smell. Maybe I just wanted him gone. I scooped up the coins and dropped them in the register, counted out his change in normal quarters and dimes, and held it out to him. He didn't take the change, just picked up the crackers, turned, and walked back toward the door. Same measured pace, same squelching footsteps. The door chime rang as he pushed outside into the rain, and then he was gone. I stood there for a moment, feeling something I couldn't name. My hands were shaking slightly. I looked down at the wet footprints trailing across the floor, then at the register where I'd dropped those coins. They were turning black, not slowly, not gradually. I watched it happen. The silver darkening like time-lapse footage of decay, spreading from the edges inward. Within seconds, they'd gone completely black, and then they started to crumble, just falling apart into powder right there in the cash drawer. I grabbed one before it fully disintegrated. It fell to pieces in my palm, leaving behind this fine, dark dust that smelled sharp and acidic. Chemical, almost. It made my eyes water. All 6 coins reduced to small piles of black powder in under a minute. My throat felt tight. I closed the register and looked at the trail of water on the floor, following it back toward the door. The overhead lights reflected off the wet spots, making them easy to track. I could see exactly where he'd walked. Straight from the door to the back wall, along the snack aisle, up to my counter, and then from the counter back toward the door. Except the trail didn't reach the door. It stopped about 10 feet short, just ended in a wet footprint as if he'd simply ceased to exist mid-step. I walked over to it, checked the floor between there and the door, completely dry. I'd watched him leave. I'd heard the chime, but the water trail ended in the middle of the floor. I checked the security camera later, old system, grainy footage, but it worked. I watched myself restocking cigarettes, watched myself look up at the door, watched myself come around the counter and speak to empty air. On the footage, I'm alone the entire time. I walk to the register, scan a package of crackers that appears on the counter, just appears, like it materialized. Then I'm talking to nothing, taking invisible coins from my own hand, putting them in the register. On camera, it looks like I'm having a conversation with myself for 3 minutes straight, then staring at the floor. But the crackers are gone from inventory, and the register was short 179 when I counted it at the end of shift. And that dust was still there in the cash drawer, smelling like metal and salt and something old. I tried to clean up the water trail with a mop. The puddles were normal enough, cold, slightly gritty with tracked-in debris. But they didn't soak into the mop right. The water seemed heavier somehow, leaving this white residue on the floor after it dried. I had to scrub it 3 times before it came up clean. Look, I know what this sounds like. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Maybe I fell asleep standing up. Maybe there was a gas leak. Maybe I had some kind of episode. But I bagged that dust from the register and took it home, and it's still in a plastic bag in my freezer. It still smells like salt and metal and something underneath I can't identify. And I can't throw it away because it's the only proof I have that something happened. I requested a transfer to day shift the following week, took a pay cut for it. My manager asked why, and I told him I was going back to school, Needed better hours. He didn't push it. Sometimes I think about that man opening those crackers. Where he went after he left. What he needed them for. Why saltines? Why those specific coins? But mostly I think about how the water trail just stopped, and how I watched the door close behind him when, according to the camera, he was never there at all. The dust in my freezer is turning white now, slowly, like the salt is separating out from whatever else was in those coins. I don't know if that means anything. Look, I'm a real estate agent. I've walked through hundreds of empty properties, and I've never been the kind of person who gets spooked by creaky floors or dark basements. But I need to tell someone about what I've found at the Hendricks farm, because I can't keep carrying this alone. The property's been on the market for 8 years, 23 acres outside Ashland, good soil, decent access road. The price kept dropping, but nobody ever made it past a second showing. My boss asked me to do a full walkthrough, take fresh photos, see if we could find an angle to move it. Standard stuff. I drove out there on a Tuesday morning, parked by the collapsed barn, and started with the house. Nothing remarkable. Empty rooms, water-stained ceilings, the usual decay you see in abandoned farmhouses. I took my photos, made my notes, and was heading back to my car when I noticed the silo. Tall, concrete, painted white about 50 years ago based on how the paint had oxidized. The door had a padlock and there was a key for it on the ring the executor had given me. I almost didn't bother. Silos don't photograph well for listings, and this one looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. But I'm thorough. It's why I've lasted 20 years in this business. So I walked over, brushed some rust off the lock, and tried the key. It turned easier than it should have. The door swung inward and the smell hit me first. Not decay, not mold. Charcoal. Fresh charcoal, like someone had just finished sketching, which made no sense because the silo was supposed to be empty. I pulled out my phone for the flashlight and stepped inside. The walls were covered in drawings, children's drawings done in charcoal, covering every inch of the curved concrete surface. I'm talking hundreds of them, maybe thousands, layered so thick in places that the charcoal had built up like sediment. They were all the same image, over and over. A house, simple, rectangular, 2 windows and a door like a kid would draw, and next to it, a tall black figure. Just a shape, really. Humanoid, but wrong somehow, with a wide smile sketched across where a face should be. The figure was in every single drawing, always the same height relative to the house, always smiling. I touched one of the drawings near the door. The charcoal underneath it crumbled slightly, and I realized the paper, if you could call it that, was layered like wallpaper. Someone had been pasting new drawings over old ones for God knows how long. There was a ladder bolted to the wall leading up to the top of the silo. I don't know why I started climbing. Professional curiosity, maybe. The idea that I'd tell my boss I'd done a complete inspection. But I think part of me needed to understand what I was looking at, even though something in my gut was already screaming at me to leave. As I climbed, I started noticing dates. Some of the drawings had them written in the corner, small and neat. 1987, 1952. I saw one that said 1923. The higher I went, the older they got. The paper got more brittle, more yellow. But the image never changed. Same house, same figure, same smile. About halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath and really looked at the layers. In some spots where the paper had torn or peeled, I could see dozens of drawings stacked beneath, each one identical to the last. My hand was shaking when I pulled my phone out to take a picture. The flash lit up the whole interior, and for just a second, I could see the full scope of it. This endless spiral of the same image, repeated over and over, going back further than should be possible. That's when I noticed the ladder rungs were smudged with charcoal. Recent smudges. Black dust on my hands. I kept climbing. I had to see the top. The drawings near the ceiling were the oldest. The paper was brown, crumbling at the edges, but preserved by the dry air inside the silo. I saw a date, 1891, then 1887. The charcoal was faint on these, faded to gray, but the image was still clear, still the same. And then I reached the top layer. Fresh paper, bright white. The charcoal was still wet. I could smell it, sharp and immediate. The drawing was perfect. Clean lines, no smudging. The house, the figure, the smile. This one was dated 2 days ago. Sunday. I was alone on that property. I'd checked the whole house. There was no car but mine on the access road. The executor had confirmed nobody had been out here in months. My chest got tight. You know that feeling when your body understands danger before your brain catches up? I couldn't get a full breath. The ladder suddenly felt unstable, even though it was bolted solid into the concrete. I looked down, and that's when I saw it. The drawings I'd passed on the way up, they were all slightly different now, not in content, in angle, like they'd been turned just a few degrees to face upward, to face me. I didn't climb down carefully. I practically fell, my shoes slipping on the rungs, my phone dropping and clattering somewhere in the dark below. When I hit the ground, I ran for the door, without looking back, without trying to find my phone. I just ran. The door seemed heavier going out, like something was pulling it closed from inside. I made it to my car, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for 10 minutes before I could turn the key. When I finally looked back at the silo, the door was open. Just a crack. I'd shut it behind me. I know I did. I told my boss the property wasn't viable. Foundation issues, I wrote it in my report. He didn't question it. The listing's still active, but I made sure my name isn't on it anymore. Here's what I can't stop thinking about. I looked up the property records when I got home. The farm's been sold and resold 17 times since 1881. Average ownership 9 months. No family ever stayed longer than 2 years. And each deed transfer lists the same reason for sale: relocated unexpectedly. I've tried finding information about the silo, about who built it or why. Nothing. It's not on any of the original surveys. It's like it's always just been there. Last week I drove past the property. I wasn't planning to. It's not on my usual route. But I found myself turning down that access road. I didn't get out of the car. I just sat there looking at the silo from a distance. The door was closed again. But there was a car parked by the barn. A sedan I didn't recognize. I should have called someone. The police maybe, or the property executor. Instead, I just left. Because part of me, the part that saw those drawings turn to face me, knows exactly what that person is doing inside that silo right now. They're climbing the ladder, they're looking at the layers, and when they reach the top, there'll be a new drawing waiting. There's always a new drawing. I still have charcoal dust under my fingernails. I've scrubbed my hands raw, but it won't come out. I'm an insurance adjuster, have been since my late 20s. I assess damage, take photos, write reports. It's boring work, mostly. The kind of job where you develop a routine and stick to it because deviation just complicates things. I mention this because I need you to understand that I'm methodical. I don't jump to conclusions. I definitely don't believe in anything I can't photograph and document. The mill outside Eugene had been vacant for 8 months when the fire happened. Small blaze contained mostly to the upper administrative offices. Electrical fault, probably. The claim was straightforward. I'd done a dozen just like it. I arrived on a Tuesday morning, early October. The air still had that burnt plastic smell, but the structure was sound. I started at the top floor and worked my way down, same as always. The basement level wasn't even supposed to be part of the assessment. The fire hadn't touched it. But I'm thorough, and the insurance company pays me to be thorough, so I went down anyway. Just to document the unaffected areas, you understand, cover all the bases. The basement was your standard industrial space. Concrete floor, exposed ductwork, those metal support columns every 20 feet or so. Dim. My flashlight cut through the darkness in that particular way it does in large, empty spaces. The beam just sort of gets swallowed after a certain distance. I could hear water dripping somewhere, which wasn't unusual. These old buildings always have moisture issues. I was about halfway through the space when I noticed it. A section of floor, maybe 6 feet in diameter, was wet. Not damp, wet, like someone had just mopped it. The concrete glistened under my flashlight beam, but here's what made me stop. Everything else down there was covered in dust and debris. The fire department had tracked soot and ash throughout the building. This wet patch, though, it was pristine, clean enough that I could see my reflection in it, sort of. The concrete around it was filthy, undisturbed, but this circle was spotless. I looked up. No pipes directly overhead, no obvious source for the water. The ceiling was dry. I know what you're thinking. Groundwater, seepage, something simple like that. I thought the same thing. But the wet area had defined edges. Water doesn't work that way. It spreads, it seeps outward. This looked like someone had poured it deliberately, like they'd outlined a perfect circle and filled it in. I took photos. Standard procedure, 6 or 7 shots from different angles, then a few close-ups. The whole time I was down there, I had this feeling. Not fear exactly, more like awareness. You know that sensation when you're certain someone's watching you but you're alone? Like that, but more intense. The silence felt wrong. Even the water I'd heard dripping earlier had stopped. I finished up quickly. Told myself I was being efficient, not spooked. I went through the rest of the building, completed my assessment, and drove back to the office. It wasn't until I uploaded the photos that evening that I saw it. The wet patch didn't look wet in any of the pictures. Instead, it appeared as a perfect circle of absolute black. Not shadow. Black. Like someone had cut a hole in the floor, and there was just nothing underneath. And here's what made my stomach drop. The black circle reflected nothing. My flash had gone off for several of the photos. I could see the reflection on the regular concrete, the metal columns, everything else. But that circle absorbed the light completely. It looked like a pool of oil, or like someone had photoshopped a solid black disc onto the floor. I checked the photo metadata. No corruption. I looked at each image individually. In every single one, the circle was there, perfectly round, perfectly black. I didn't sleep well that night. Kept thinking about that reflection I'd seen when I was down there. My own face looking up at me from the wet concrete. In my memory, though, something about it seemed off. The proportions weren't quite right, maybe. Or the angle was wrong. I couldn't pin it down. I drove back to the mill the next morning. I told myself it was just due diligence, that I needed to recheck something for the report. The truth is, I needed to see that floor again. The basement was exactly as I'd left it. Same dust, same debris. But the wet patch was gone. The concrete was completely dry. I stood there with my flashlight scanning the area where I knew it had been, and that's when I saw it. An impression in the concrete. Not a crack, not damage from the fire. An impression, like someone had pressed something into the surface when it was still wet, decades ago when this floor was poured. Except that's impossible because I'd photographed this exact spot yesterday and there was nothing there but wet, clean concrete. The impression was a footprint. A single, massive human footprint. Barefoot from the look of it. I could see the individual toe marks, the arch, the heel. It was easily twice the size of my own foot, maybe larger. And it was deep, pressed down into the concrete at least half an inch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to photograph it. I took maybe a dozen pictures, and when I looked at them on my screen, they showed exactly what I was seeing. A footprint, clear as day, no black circle, no wet patch, just this impossible impression in concrete that had been solid and unmarked for probably 50 years. Here's the thing that kept me up for the next week. The footprint was positioned right in the center of where the wet patch had been, and it was oriented like someone had been standing there, facing the exact spot where I had been standing when I first noticed the water. I submitted my report. Didn't mention the footprint, didn't mention the wet patch. What would I even say? The claim went through without issues. The building's slated for demolition next month anyway, from what I understand. Some developer bought the property. But I keep thinking about that reflection, the one I saw in the wet concrete. Because looking back now, I'm almost certain the face looking up at me wasn't quite my own. The features were close, similar enough that I didn't notice in the moment, but the expression was wrong. I've tried to remember exactly what I saw, but it's like trying to recall a dream. The harder I focus, the more it slips away. Last week, I was assigned to assess fire damage at a warehouse in Springfield. Different building, different circumstances. I went down to the lower level to check for smoke damage, and there in the corner, I saw a wet patch on the floor. Smaller this time, maybe 3 feet across. Perfectly circular, perfectly clean. I didn't photograph it. I turned around and walked out. I told my supervisor I felt sick, needed to go home. Someone else finished that assessment. The footprint is still there at the mill, far as I know. Sometimes I think about going back, seeing if it's changed, if it's gotten deeper, or if there are more of them now. But I won't. I can't explain why the concrete was wet, or why my photos showed something different than what I saw with my own eyes, or how a footprint appeared in solid concrete overnight. I'm done trying to make sense of it. What bothers me most is this. I looked up the history of that mill after I saw the footprint. It was built in 1962. But the property records show there was another structure there before, back in the 30s. It burned down. Completely. They never found the night watchman who was supposed to be on duty. Just vanished. They poured the new foundation right over the old one when they rebuilt. I don't work cases involving fire damage anymore. Told my boss it was affecting my sleep, which is true enough. They moved me to automotive claims. Easier, cleaner. But now when it rains and I see puddles on the sidewalk, I find myself walking around them instead of through them. I don't like looking at my reflection in standing water. I'm afraid if I look too close, I'll see something looking back that isn't quite me. I've been picking antiques for about 15 years now. Nothing glamorous. I find underpriced pieces at estate sales, clean them up, resell them for a modest profit. It's supplemental income, really. I work IT during the week. Point is, I've handled hundreds of old objects. I know wood rot from patina. I know when something's genuinely valuable versus reproduced junk. I'm not someone who gets spooked by old furniture. The Hendricks estate was up near Grants Pass, one of those properties that's been in the same family since the 1890s. The last owner died without close relatives, so everything had to go. I drove 3 hours to get there early before the dealers cleaned out anything worthwhile. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, hemmed in by Douglas firs so thick they kept the place in permanent shade. Inside smelled like dust and mothballs and something else. Something sweet and rotten I couldn't quite place. Most of the furniture was Victorian-era reproductions, nothing special. But in the upstairs hallway, wedged between a linen closet and a narrow window, stood this display cabinet. 7 feet tall, maybe 3 feet wide. Dark walnut, I thought, though the grain pattern seemed off somehow. Ornate scrollwork along the top, brass hinges that should have been green with verdigris but gleamed like they'd been polished yesterday. The glass doors were beveled, slightly wavy in that way old glass gets. I asked the estate manager about it. She was this tired-looking woman in her 60s, running the whole sale by herself. She barely glanced at the cabinet before saying $50. I actually laughed, told her she was undercharging. She just shrugged and said the family wanted it gone and no one else had shown interest. Should have wondered why. I loaded it into my truck with help from another picker. The thing weighed maybe 200 pounds, but it moved easily, almost too easily. During the drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, making sure it hadn't shifted. Something about the proportions bothered me in a way I couldn't articulate. The cabinet seemed bigger in the reflection than it actually was. My workshop's a converted garage behind my house. I set the cabinet against the back wall, wiped it down, checked the joinery. Hand-cut dovetails. No maker's mark, which was unusual for something this quality. The wood grain caught the light strangely, swirling patterns that didn't quite match from one panel to the next. I ran my hand over the surface and it felt warm. Not like sun-warmed wood, but body-warm. Internal warmth. I left it overnight to acclimate. The next morning, I noticed the glass doors were warm too. Not hot, just several degrees above room temperature. I thought maybe there was a heat duct I'd forgotten about, but when I checked, the nearest vent was 12 feet away and barely functional. I touched the glass again. Definite warmth, concentrated right at the center of each pane. The doors were locked when I first got the cabinet. I'd planned to pick the lock that day, but when I returned after lunch, they hung open about 2 inches. I know I didn't open them. I live alone. No one else has keys to my workshop. Inside the cabinet was completely empty. 5 shelves lined with burgundy felt, slightly faded but intact. The interior smelled like cedarwood and something mineral. Salt, maybe. I closed the doors firmly, heard the lock mechanism click. An hour later, they were open again. I tried locking them with an external padlock through the brass handles. The next morning, the padlock was on the floor, still locked, and the doors were ajar. The metal hasp hadn't been cut or damaged. It was like the doors had simply passed through it. Here's the thing. I should have gotten rid of it then. I know how this sounds. But I kept thinking there had to be a rational explanation. Warped wood expanding and contracting. A faulty lock mechanism. I'd invested $50 in 3 hours of driving. I wanted to solve the problem, not run from it. On the 4th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. with this feeling like I'd forgotten to turn off the stove. You know that creeping certainty that something's wrong? I got out of bed and looked out my window toward the workshop. The lights were off, but through the window I could see a faint amber glow. Just a suggestion of light, like a candle behind thick glass. I pulled on shoes and went outside. Gravel crunched too loud under my feet. The workshop door was unlocked. I definitely had locked it. And inside, the cabinet doors stood wide open. The amber glow came from inside the cabinet itself, though there was no light source I could identify, just this diffuse illumination that made the burgundy felt look wet. On the bottom shelf sat a small skull, maybe 3 inches long, delicate bone structure, elongated snout with tiny serrated teeth. reptilian, but wrong somehow. The proportions didn't match anything I could identify. The bone was desiccated, yellowed with age, and sitting in the exact center of the shelf like it had been carefully positioned. I hadn't put it there. My hands were shaking as I reached for it. The bone felt light, hollow, and warm like the glass. I pulled my hand back and stepped away from the cabinet. The amber glow was already fading. Within seconds, it was gone completely, and I was standing in my dark workshop holding my phone's flashlight, looking at this impossible object. I took the skull out, put it on my workbench, closed the cabinet doors. They locked with that same solid click. For 2 days, nothing happened. The doors stayed closed. The warmth in the glass faded to normal temperature. I researched the skull online, sent photos to a friend who teaches biology. He said it looked like a juvenile monitor lizard maybe, but the teeth were wrong and the orbital structure didn't match any species he recognized. He asked where I got it. I lied and said I found it hiking. I put the skull in a drawer in my house. Told myself I'd deal with the cabinet later, maybe resell it. I didn't go back to the workshop for 3 days. When I finally did, the cabinet doors were open again. There were 2 skulls now. The original was back on the bottom shelf, and next to it sat something else. A bird skull, I think, but elongated and with too many small holes in the bone. Same yellowed coloration, same careful positioning. I know what you're thinking. Someone's messing with me, breaking in, staging this. But my workshop has no other entrance, and the doors show no signs of forced entry. I installed a motion-activated camera pointed directly at the cabinet. The footage showed nothing, just the closed cabinet sitting there in darkness. Then, at 2:47 a.m., a single frame of the doors standing open with both skulls visible. The next frame showed them closed again. No transition, no movement. Just closed, then open, then closed. The frame counter showed no missing footage. I've stopped going into the workshop. The skulls are still in there, I assume. Maybe more have appeared. I don't know. The cabinet's doors are probably standing open right now, that amber glow pulsing in the darkness, waiting to add something else to its collection. Last week, my neighbor asked if I was selling the cabinet, said he'd noticed it through the workshop window and thought it was beautiful. I told him it wasn't for sale. He said that's too bad, because his wife collects antique display cases and they'd give me a good price. I said no. I don't know why I said no.